There's a few things that I want to cover, talking a little bit about what each of the ranks are, how we approach and reference them, when speaking to them directly, that kind of thing, and also a little bit about their historical role and how that relates to the modern role. So, kind of a lot for each of these, but hopefully it will be helpful. On the back, I won't specifically cover this per se, but it's just a little chart of all the things showing what they wear when they're not serving, what they wear when they are serving. There can be some variation. Hats, for example, is something that can vary quite a bit. Little variations in some of the awards that get put on. But generally speaking, this is a good indication. I apologize a little bit. I've struggled to find a good picture of a subdeacon, so they're a little small there, but you can see there's three of them in a row. And then, of course, off to the side in that last column, how you reference them. So some of that will be covered over here. I'm not going to specifically go over this unless there's a question about something on it, but just so you're aware, this is kind of a summary of the front in a slightly more visual form. So, all right, so bishops. We've talked a little bit about bishops, I think, in the past, but they are the sole authority in their diocese, their territory. So I don't want to do a lot of this today, but just very briefly, if you're at all familiar with certain other jurisdictions that have a single person who's in charge of the entire group, historically, that was a bishop, a patriarch, who had the first seat on the synod of their local diocese, and eventually that sort of morphed into what it is today, with the papacy. But we don't have anyone in that role. So if our bishop here in San Francisco says that we need to change something here, no one can overrule him. Now, if he's going crazy and saying all sorts of weird stuff, we'll talk about this in a little bit, the other bishops can step in and have a chat with him and eventually even maybe remove him if there's a problem. But generally speaking, what he says goes in his churches. Everyone who serves in any capacity lower down this list serves at his discretion. So I am, as we were talking about before, I'm the assigned director here. George is simply attached to this parish. So therefore, I make all the decisions. I sit on parish council. I do everything in his place. But I still have to send the end result of all of these things off to him. Every time our parish council meets, we have to send it off to the bishop and sign and say, that sounds good. Every time we have new people elected to join the parish council, the bishop has to sign off and say, yeah, okay. So everything we do here. You remember I talked about the things that were on the altar, right? And there's that cloth under the gospel I said we have to have in order to serve. That's signed by the bishop. If he takes that away, then we can't do services. Everything we do here is with his blessing, including things like this class, right? Although he didn't explicitly sign off on this particular thing, but the concept of teaching the new people that come in is very much under his purview, and he could step in and say yay or nay on any aspect of this if he wanted. In the liturgy, we have this part you'll hear the choir saying, or you'll hear me say, the bishop rightly divide the word of God's truth, and then the choir sings strong and kind. So, like I said, without his blessing, nothing happens. Wonderful, hello. Hello. When bishops get together, they form councils or synods, and we sometimes refer to these as a church or a jurisdiction. So in North America, we have a bunch of them. We have the OCA, which is what this parish is a part of, and our bishop. ROCOR, Ethiopian Greek. There's a bunch of others, Serbian, Romanian, Bulgarian, probably others too. Each of these is a synod, a collection of bishops that basically talk together. Now, it doesn't, I don't know that I specifically call this out elsewhere, but we don't make a distinction. So OCA, ROCOR, Antiochian, whatever, from a layperson's perspective is identical. Any of them are fine. When we went to the Greek church for their parish feast, everyone was invited to come. There was nothing special that had to be done. I, as clergy, have to get a blessing to serve by both my hierarch and by the hierarch of the parish I was going to in order to serve there, because it's not part of our jurisdiction. All right, so I mentioned this a little bit in the act of applying. The bishops in the area can get together and form a special kind of trial. If just asking them what's going on and to not do the weird crazy thing doesn't work, this trial has the ability to potentially suspend a bishop, and then with the approval of the full synod, they can confirm the trial's recommendation, and then the bishop would be removed. So that's the only way that the authority of a bishop within his diocese can be overruled, is when he's just removed from the diocese altogether. Usually, although not always in that case, that would be accompanied by being made not a bishop anymore. Usually if there's something going on like that, it's a very big problem. So he would be what's called laicized, which means that he would no longer be a bishop, he would just be a simple monk, which we'll talk about the monastics when we get there, but and someone else would have to step in. So all right, when we talk to bishops directly, there are any number of terms that are non-English. So you'll hear people say Vladika for Slavic countries, Sayedna for Arabic, Antiochian, etc. Technically, despota is the Greek, although I don't think they tend to use that except liturgically. We do say in English, master, in our services. So when a bishop is present, instead of saying Father bless, we would say Master bless. If you were to approach to the blessing like we'll see people do for me, they say Father bless when they approach me, they say Master bless when they approach the bishop. There are any number of ways to refer to them depending on their rank, their bishop and archbishop, metropolitan, etc. In writing your grace, your evidence, your beatitude, you may recognize these as like medieval things for royalty and forms of governance. That's where we got them from. Metropolitan, archbishop, even patriarch, though, just to be clear, they're all bishops. They may sit at a slightly higher rank within the synod, but at the end of the day, they are still the only one with authority in their diocese and have no authority directly over anyone else's diocese. So, for example, it is the recommendation and preference of the Metropolitan of the OCA that when serving anything that doesn't involve fully busting, when I would just really painting his name on the side there, that we also wear cuffs. In his diocese, in his territory, that is a requirement. Here, our bishop hasn't said anything, one way or the other, so I think it's probably the norm to follow the recommendation of the Metropolitan, but he could very well say, no, that is not our practice, don't do that, and then we wouldn't. I like to refer to these ranks above bishop more like, if you are familiar with the way our house works here in America, we have a Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House, right, has more authority than the others, but when it comes down to a vote, they have one vote, just like everyone else, right? They can, work with people that are arguing back and forth a little bit. They can try and calm tensions, whatnot. They can call things to vote. They can encourage things not to go to vote, right? They do have some additional authority in that regard. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to voting on something, one vote just like everyone else. So it's the same way with our, whether it's an archbishop or a metropolitan or theoretically patriarch. When it comes down to it, they convene the synod meeting. They may recommend that certain things be talked about or whatever, but when it comes down to voting, they have no more authority than any other bishop. Right, and then, like I said, you can always, at any point in time, basically go with the blessing of the bishop, master bless, or the bless, in the Slavic form, Sayedna, I suppose, fits in Arabic, Antiochian bishop. And then finally, just to note, our bishops cannot be married. So that's a distinction that we'll get to with priests here in just a minute, which obviously priests can be married. I'm sure you all are aware of the fact that I'm wearing a wedding ring and I have a wife and several children. The reason that bishops cannot get married is because it would be very hard on the family. There is no theological reason against it. The disciples and apostles, some of them are married as well, right? So it's not that there's something against marriage. It's not that we have a problem with marriage. It's It's just that the bishop's job is to be the shepherd for all of the parishes within his diocese. That's very hard. It's a lot of travel. Archbishop Benjamin, at least before he started having serious issues with his health, traveled, it's like 200 something odd days of the year. He was constantly traveling to visit all of his parishes and check in with them all. It was the norm, even though this is a very large diocese, most parishes, I think, had a visit with him about once a year, sometimes more. Very hard to do all of that and maintain a reasonable relationship with your family and kids. So, in the interest of just not having that be a problem, we have our bishops not be married. That means that they are monks, but they don't really function within a monastery the way we think of like a monastery, which is north of here with a few monks. Bishops, like I said, are traveling all the time, so even though they are on paper monastics, they don't necessarily live a life in a monastery. Alright, priests. So, again, just to be very clear, I serve in the place of the bishop with this blessing. He could strip me of that at any time, for any reason. If he's doing it willy-nilly without any reason, he might get a talking through from his brother bishops, and they may even step in and do something about it, but I'm not aware of that ever happening in the history of our OCA here. I don't know, maybe it's some petty reasons, but generally speaking, we are granted to serve the liturgy when he's not present. When he is present, priests will serve with him, although technically there don't have to be priests serving when a bishop is serving. It's not common, but I have heard of a handful of situations, especially going into like a very small mission where there isn't an assigned priest yet, or in Alaska where there's just these tiny little village parishes dotted all over the place, and they don't necessarily all have a priest at any given time. It may just be the bishop serving by himself. But anyway, technically speaking, when a priest is present for a bishop serving, we don't really have any particular job other than to look pretty. And we're given some things to do, but it's only because the bishop is letting us, basically. Like I said before, we serve on a cloth called the antimons. It has a relic in it, so even in a place like this where we don't have a consecrated altar, we're still serving on relics, which is a very important rule for us. I can't just go serve in random places. I would have to take the antimons with me, and if it's taken away by the bishop, I'm out of luck. The only sacrament that a priest cannot do by himself is the confecting of chrism, which is what we use to bring catechumens in. We chrismate them with chrism. The making of that is a sacrament that is reserved for the bishops and the distribution of it. So you may be aware in the Catholic Church that they do, children are received a little bit later, and then their confirmation happens much later. For those things relate to our sacraments, the baptism is baptism, and that's the same. But what they call confirmation, we call chrismation. We do it immediately after, and it's done by a priest, whereas in the Catholic world, at least my understanding is that's done by a bishop. We reserve that is the role or rank of bishop to do the bringing, the reception of people into the church, but he gives a blessing by the conferring of the chrism he has made for us to do that sacrament. So again, should he take that away for some reason, then I would not be able to bring people into the church. Alright. Similarly to a bishop acting out of line, if a priest is acting out of line, there is a trial called by the bishop presiding over it. It functions very similarly, conceptually anyway, to a legal trial. There's a jury of peers, so for a bishop that would be a jury of other bishops, for a priest it would be other priests, who listen to everything and then make a recommendation to the bishop as to what to do. Like I said before, technically speaking, he could just at any time strip me of my priesthood, but that would be very weird. This trial is very much the norm. Would he what?
Strip the priest title away.
I don't know, if he walks into church and I'm beating someone in the corner, probably, what's the point of a trial? He saw me punching someone, that's not okay, right? Anytime where the bishop, walks in on something, I would imagine that could be grounds to just immediately, at the very least, suspend. But what is a trial, right? Tell you other than the bishop saw. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, even in something, very heinous, if a priest is accused of murdering a parishioner or something like that, I mean, you'd still want to make sure that it's not just a baseless accusation, make sure that even if it was by my hand, that it was a thing I was trying to do versus a thing that accidentally happened. In either case, I would no longer be allowed to serve. Anyone with blood on their hands is not allowed to be priest. But whether I am simply not allowed to serve or formally stripped of my priesthood would be a different thing.
Are you allowed to drink?
Yes, but we're not supposed to get drunk. I mean, our chalice is filled with wine, so you don't really have a choice there. Yeah. All right. You can always refer to a priest as priest. I think that sounds weird to people's ears to hear priest John or priest Gregory or priest Daniel, but that's valid, right? We say Archbishop Benjamin. You can, of course, refer to them as some diminutive. For bishop, I said, right? Vladika said, and that's what's in English. We tend to use father, but that is absolutely not necessary. If it is uncomfortable for you, or if you've got a friend or family or someone coming and they don't feel comfortable saying father because certain groups have issues with that, fine. You call doctors doctor, call the priest priest. It's fine. It's a recognition at least of the rank without trying to say there's any relationship there, which is fine. You will often hear liturgically, if we are praying for a priest who is sick or something like that, in the litanies we'll say priest, whomever. You can almost always ask for priest blessing, Father bless. The one time you cannot is when a bishop is present. If a bishop is present, you always ask his blessing, not the priest. If you do, I will just tell you to go get the blessing from the bishop. It's not a problem per se. I just won't do it. No one will be offended that you did that. I'll just direct you to the bishop. We can be married, like I said before. The wives are given a title as well. This varies in a lot of things by ethnicity. We don't tend to use mother, even though that's what these translate to. I think the reason for that is because to American ears, mother means monastic, and that's not what they are. But that's what we're saying. You're just not saying it in English when you use any of these other terms. Matушka, well, I take it back actually. Presbytera literally just means female priest in Greek. Presbyter, right? Presbytera. So that's a little distinction. But all of the Slavic words in one form or another all harken back to just calling them mother. Don't have to be married. I didn't put this in here. A priest does not have to be married, and they don't have to be a monk. So the parish just north of here in Berkeley, for example, has a non-monastic, non-married priest. I don't think he was ever married. Sometimes that happens if a priest is married and then the wife dies or leaves them or something like that. But not always. Sometimes they just didn't get married. That's totally acceptable. Sometimes they will later become a monk, but not always. So. All right. Deacons. So this is the first role that I presume is maybe slightly less consistent with the other jurisdictions, or not jurisdictions, other Christian denominations. So deacons liturgically are assistants. So we don't have one here, at least not at the moment. We do have someone in the program who will eventually be ordained a deacon, but that's still a few years off. If you're able to come to our parish feast, although I know that that's a morning service, I think we'll have 2 or 3 deacons coming for that. So that will be wonderful. You'll get to see their actions in the service. They make the service go a lot smoother. lot of times, if you've noticed there being pauses sometimes in our service, especially, there's a few petitions that if the choir is a little too quick, there's just a moment to pause in between. It's because I've got a bunch of big long prayers to do and nowhere else to do them, because I also have to do the petitions. If the deacon were present, then he would be doing the petitions, and I would have lots of time to do these prayers and not be blasting through them as quick as I possibly can and not delay the service. But unfortunately, the reality is that coming from the Greek world, the Ottoman yoke, coming from the Slavic world, the communist yoke, deacons were one of the first ranks to go. If you are able to be ordained a deacon, you could theoretically be ordained a priest, and you need priests a lot more than you need deacons. So they didn't completely die out, but in both areas of the world, they became a lot less common. And that's sort of been inherited here in North America, where they are not super common. They're becoming more common. So there's a few in the Bay Area here, but you'll see canons that say that every parish should have 7 deacons. We certainly don't have enough deacons to do that. Yes.
What kind of life do you have to live to become a priest?
So there's a number of what are called impediments to be ordained, whether to the diaconate or the priesthood, or bishop, I suppose, for that matter. But generally speaking, you have to be very soundly and squarely in the church. So usually the minimum, although some bishops are a lot more strict about this than others, is 3 years after having been received.
Was received mean? Sorry for cutting you off.
The reason I say that is because sometimes that means baptized, sometimes that means chrismated, so depending on your method of reception in the church. 3 years after that, then you will be allowed to go to seminary, which is usually roughly 3-year program. So you'll be ordained after 6 years. If you are young, they usually recommend you figure out if you want to get married or not, because you can be married, but you cannot get married. That's true for deacon and priest. The reason being that there's kind of a power dynamic, right? It's considered pretty not okay for a doctor to marry a patient, right? It's kind of the same thing as clergy. Most of the people I interact with, I hear their confessions. I'm, baptizing their babies and burying their dying, right? It's kind of weird for me to then be dating one of them. So that's not okay. So I can be married when I am ordained, but I cannot get married after I have been ordained. Other than that, it is really up to the bishop. I mean, like I said, there's a few things. You can't have killed anyone. You have to be physically capable of serving. So if you are missing both your legs or something like that, then you can't reasonably be a priest because you can't do the things you have to do. You have to be able to read. Trying to think of at least the more obvious ones. Part of the process is doing a background check, doing a psych evaluation, making sure that you're not crazy and power hungry. So there's a lot of just making sure that you are, even if it's not a specific thing to be checking for, that just in general are a good match. And also, there's a part of the ordination process which is that your spiritual father, the person you go to confession to, has to give their yea or nay. They don't have to say why, but if you're confessing something repeatedly that's really quite bad, they would know that you probably shouldn't be ordained. And again, they don't have to say what it is, they don't have to divulge that, but they at least have to give the yes, this person is not in any particularly bad situation spiritually right now, or they are actually. So it's a lot. There's a little bit that's a little open to interpretation. So there's a wide variety of clergy. My classmate that's over in Pleasanton, at the church there, was a pastor in Presbyterian Korean church or something like that for many years, and converted, and a few years later went to seminary, and was in that regard a little bit green. He's a wonderful priest. He picked everything up quite nicely and does a very good job of all that. Some of my classmates, like me, were born and raised in the church, so you just get a wide variety of clergy, and it's sort of up to the priest or the bishop to put the priests in parish matches and all that. So, yeah. All right. That was a much broader There is no instance where, so getting back to deacons, there's no instance that a deacon can serve any service without a priest or bishop present. This again is a distinguishing feature from certain other Christian groups, at least the Catholic Church. I think Anglican and some other ones as well will allow deacons to do some things, marriages or funerals, that kind of thing. They cannot for us; they are assistants only. They can do some things. It's not uncommon to have deacons teach this kind of class. It's not uncommon to have deacons do things like run. For a very, well, I think still, the diaconal vocations program is run by a deacon at the diocesan level. It's not uncommon to have choral programs run by deacons. A lot of the outreach stuff is often handled by deacons. You can refer to them as deacon or father. You will sometimes hear people say father deacon. That is very weird. Please don't do that. It's pretty accepted in some places, so you will definitely hear people say that sometimes. But it's weird. You don't say father priest. You don't say master bishop. Why would you say father deacon? They are a deacon, so you can call them deacon. We use father because of the relationship that is present with any of these upper ranks of clergy. So father is also fine, but just have it combined. Historically, deacons would do things like do a lot of the catechesis, and then they would prepare and bring people, and the priest would do like the final acts of the baptismal service. But most of the rest of that was done by deacons. We'll talk a little bit about deaconesses later, but back in the day, it was not acceptable, it was not considered for a male to enter a female residence, especially for like a widow or unmarried young lady. They have their separate quarters that they lived in. And so if they were sick, if they were dying, if they needed something, a male deacon couldn't go to them. So male deaconesses would go and do that kind of community outreach. These days, that's not really a problem that we have to deal with, so that rank is mostly died out. Okay, we'll talk about more later. Deacons, again, can be married, but not yet married. And their wives are called by basically the same thing as priest wives in Lesser Greek, and then they are given the female form of deacon, diaconissa. All right, those are the upper three ranks of clergy. Are there any questions on those before we move on to the lower ranks of clergy?
Is it true? I saw in certain dioceses, like maybe the Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox and so forth, like metropolitan archbishops, sometimes one's actually be higher form, the other one says it's purely just a
In
regional.
my opinion, the Greeks are correct in their usage of that. A metropolitan is the bishop of a metropolitan area. So the Chicago metropolitan area has a metropolitan who is bishop over all of the churches in that densely populated area. The Seattle metropolitan area has a metropolitan. The San Francisco metropolitan area has a metropolitan. And then the archbishop is above, arch meaning like archpastor, over all of the bishops in the area. The Russians, for reasons I don't fully understand, kept the term metropolitan and then just did their own thing with it. So they do archbishop as the step above bishop. It's basically just an award. It doesn't tend to mean very much. And then metropolitan or patriarch are used interchangeably depending on where you are. So we here have our highest title be a metropolitan. There are very few places that do patriarchs. Constantinople, Istanbul, Moscow, some of the very old churches will do patriarchs, but they don't practically hold any more authority than a metropolitan here in the OCA.
Like so there would probably be another distinction of patriarchs if there was ever a new ecumenical council, and then they'd be like, hey, like there's Orthodoxy is spread, we'll put a patriarch in this region now, maybe.
The way it would happen is the question you're asking how we would get someone with the title of patriarch?
Yeah, like similar to like the original like 5.
The way it would work is we just decide we get one. That's the way it worked with most of the others. So we would just say, hey, he's a patriarch now, and then we give him the appropriate titles. Yeah, in that regard, then the metropolitan just sort of becomes another rank that you get. Sometimes they're territorial, but other times not. So I think in Russia, bishop and archbishop are basically interchangeable. It's just an award. Metropolitan will be for like basically a state, and then the patriarch is the whole country.
Because I know, like in the liturgy, you say archbishop and metropolitan, so there's two
Yeah.
different ones that you're.
So Archbishop Benjamin is the bishop for this diocese. Metropolitan Tikhon is the metropolitan, or the highest bishop in the OCA. So those are two sources of
Because like the metropolitan down point, like they kind of made up like the U.S. is that's a metropolitan, like that one basically, then right?
Yeah, so for us, the metropolitan is all of North America, United States, Canada, Mexico. In the, like I said, in the Greek world, there's a metropolitan of San Francisco, there's a metropolitan of Seattle, there's a metropolitan of all these different areas, and then there's Archbishop Alpheoforos, who is the Archbishop of the entire Greek world here in the U.S. So, all right, anything else?
And for deaconesses, maybe you'll cover it.
I will.
The
We'll talk about it more in
Yeah.
a little bit. I'll hold off on that.
Yeah.
Anything else? All right, so minor clergy. I didn't put a header or anything, but we call the upper three major, lower three minor clergy. So some deacons oftentimes just serve as the leader in the altar. Again, we don't have any here. They're more common than deacons. It's not uncommon to see subdeacons. I don't know why we don't have one. I think it's just kind of circumstance that we've not had anyone given that. But when a bishop is present, so their official role is to be an assistant to the bishop. So Archbishop Benjamin has a subdeacon that goes whichever he does and makes sure that the parish that he's visiting knows when they need to do the different things and where the people need to stand and when the doors and stuff need to open that's different from a normal service because there's a bishop present. They're referred to as subdeacons. Their wives don't have any titles. Technically speaking, subdeacons are held to the same standard as the ranks above, meaning that they can be but not get married. In practice, that is rarely followed. Subdeacons are usually allowed to marry without any exception. I think there are some bishops that are a little more particular about that, but generally speaking, we don't follow that canon for the most part. I will note some places, and I think we saw this at the Greek parish, it's a little more common in the Greek world. You'll note, so if you look at the picture in the back, they have a stiparium that wraps over the shoulder in some form or another. There's a few different styles. It goes over the shoulder for deacons. For subdeacons, they wear the same thing, but it goes over both shoulders in a cross in the front and back. You will see sometimes, if you travel around other Orthodox parishes, sometimes altar servers will also wear a stiparium. You'll know the difference because they don't cross it in the front, the way that you see in the picture here, it's crossed in the front. It just goes straight down. I have no idea where that practice comes from or why it's done, but it is not unheard of. So don't assume that if they have something going over both shoulders, it's subdeacon unless it's crossed in the front. If it is crossed in the front, it's definitely subdeacon. Oh, sorry, one more thing I wanted to mention. So just to call out, because it's a little hard to see in the pictures in the back. So bishops, priests, and deacons all wear, when not serving, the inner cassock and this longer, flowy outer cassock. Technically, this is slightly formal, so we're supposed to wear the outer one definitely when we're doing services and when we're around hierarchs. Other times, it's not uncommon to see priests that will either wear a vest instead of this, or sometimes not, just a cross or something like that. Subdeacons and below, if you look on the back, still wear cassocks, but they only wear the inner one. So you will not see the bigger flowy one. The only exception to this, again, jumping back to the Greeks, is they have, as a form of choral garb, a practice of just wearing the outer cassock with nothing underneath. So you probably saw, and if you ever have, the rest of you ever have any opportunity to go into a Greek church, you'll see the people singing in the choirs wherever they have that. There'll probably be a few, at least, people wearing this longer flowy garment, but instead of more black underneath, they'll just have normal church dress clothes. That's just basically just a choir member. Alright. And then I guess I didn't talk about it either, but the cross. This is a Slavic thing to have priests wear this all the time. So in the OCA, in Rokor, Serbian, Bulgarian, Romanian, any of these that come from the Slavic world, deacons will never wear a cross like this. Otherwise, the clothing is identical to priests and bishops, but they will never wear a cross. Priests will always wear a cross, and bishops will wear basically an icon of the Theotokos, unless they're serving, in which case they will wear a cross and the icon of the Theotokos. And sometimes, if they're given awards and other stuff, they may end up having others. So if you look at Metropolitan Tikhon, he's actually got 3 things around his neck in the picture of him serving at the top. Alright. In the Greek world and in some other places, this cross is an award, and so you will have priests that look exactly like deacons. There is no way to tell them apart. And they will at some point be awarded a cross, and then you can tell them apart just by looking at them. But in the Greek world, I think it tends to be a number of years before the priests get awarded a cross to wear just all the time. So just be warned, if you ever are somewhere else and go to ask a blessing, they may very well go, just deacon. Or you might not see anyone wearing a cross, and you might not know who to get your blessing from. I guess just go with one of them and figure it out. Yeah. The story, I have no idea if this is true, but the story behind why we have these is because the Tsar went to ask a blessing from someone who he thought was a priest on the road and was angered to find out it was just a deacon, and was like, this is stupid. Priests all need to wear a cross, and then we can tell who they are. Again, I don't know if that's technically true, but it's a fun story nevertheless. Alright. So readers, this is the last rank of clergy that we have today, at least. Very commonly. These are people, as the name implies, that know how to read. Part of the process of being ordained is literally demonstrating to the bishop that you know how to read. He will hand you the epistle and open it to a random page, and you have to read from it until he tells you to stop and show him that you can read. Which of course is not a skill most people don't have today, but we have sort of interpreted that to mean not just the technical ability to read the words on the page, but the ability to do it nicely in a way that people want to listen to. Also, they often are expected to have a little more knowledge about how our services are put together. So on the back, I've got a picture of our own reader, Alex, there, in the early Catholic Greek epistle. He knows the services inside and out. So you'll often see him if our younger choir director, who is still kind of figuring things out a little bit. Not that there's a problem there, but just the practicality of not having done this for as many decades, I think, as reader Alex has. She runs into something that he'll just kind of step in and point in the direction. I don't think it's a technical requirement, but it is very much the norm that readers will be at least a little bit more versed in putting the services together. As it is the case here, he handles the schedule of readers for the hours before liturgy, for the epistle, on any of the Old Testament readings we do during vigils, things like that. He's got a whole schedule and assigns people to that.
Is Daniel also becoming a reader now?
He is one, yes.
Because now he wears the same thing also.
Yes. Yeah, he just didn't have one before. Now he does. So, yeah. They are called reader whomever, so I refer to them as reader Alex, reader Daniel, etc. And again, no special title for them. Alright. Historically, there were several other ranks of clergy in different forms. Bell ringers rang the bells, sword readers greeted people at the doors, choir singers themselves. If you get a chance and you look at the second of the very high icons with the silver background, you'll notice that on our left, there's a bunch of people standing around with triple pointed hats. That was a distinguishing feature of an ordained choir member back in the day. It's a little sad that choir members don't get funny hats now, but can't have everything else. In some form or another, these are sometimes maintained. So if in this diocese, it's my understanding there are 2 or 3 maybe tonsure bell ringers, people that were set aside who have the skills. Because it is a fairly complex thing. We don't ring the bells here all of the times and in all of the ways that it is technically called for. We do some, but there's a whole giant rubric around when and how you ring the bells. Door greeting also was something that used to be an ordained ministry. All of these things were so because they were outward facing. There were things that would, stations that were interacting with the public, and therefore there's an expectation of decorum and expectation of knowledgeability about the services and the way we do things, and therefore we would only set people aside for those roles that have those skills. As I mentioned before, with the various troubles of Ottoman and communist yokes, a lot of these kind of fell away with time. And so while you will note that we have people that ring the bells, we have people that greet at the doors, we have people that sing in the choir, none of them, unless they are one of the other ranks above that we've mentioned, are actually tonsured or ordained or in any way set aside specifically for those roles. All right, so this is the time to talk about deaconesses a little bit. Deaconesses have never died out. I know that there's controversy around them, and if you are at all online and follow Orthodoxy, you will find all manner of opinion about them. The reality is, they have never gone away. There's a historical record of a deaconess being sent from Russia to Japan at the turn of the last century to help him with his catechesis. There have been deaconesses in Africa, to my knowledge, pretty much nonstop. There was a very public ordination of a large number of them, I think in the 90s or something like that, but that wasn't reinstitution of something that had gone away, they just needed more. The reality is that a lot of the social pressures that caused there to be a need for deaconesses no longer exist. So, like I mentioned before, about having private sections of a residence that are for women only, that doesn't really exist now. There were, in the early church, you were baptized completely naked. That was not something that was considered acceptable for men to be around for. So the deaconess would do the dunking in the water, and the priest would come once they had clothes back on to do the prayers and finish that process and imprison you at the end. We don't baptize that way anymore. I would get a serious talking to from my bishop if I encouraged people to be baptized completely naked. So a lot of these pressures just don't exist anymore. But in places where they do, in places where they have maintained deaconesses, they still serve. It's important to note, I don't believe there's any evidence of deaconesses ever doing much, if at all, any liturgical tasks. So when you see deacons serving for a parish feast in a few weeks, you will see that they serve in the altar. They serve standing around all of the liturgy at the altar. They have very integrated roles in the liturgy. In the early church, the deacons and deaconesses both stood generally outside the altar and did not enter, doing petitions from out there, and physically leading the people. So you'll note that the deacon will often point to things and tell you to stand, or tell you to pay attention, or cross himself. All of these are very purposefully leading actions to encourage the congregation to do what he's doing. In places where you have men and women on one side, you have the deacon on one side and the deaconess on the other, pointing to things and crossing themselves and sort of leading that half of the congregation at the same time. But again, that's a very different role from the modern deacon who stands at the altar, who gets to interact with the chalice and discourse and is a lot more involved in the actual serving of the think there has been some speculation that there may have been some form of cassock, sort of like you see nuns wearing. Similarly to how the monastic garb for men looks a heck of a lot like what I'm wearing. But again, there was no liturgical role, so there was no liturgical vestment. Alright, does that answer that?
Yeah, because I was gonna say because I forgot which emperor, or the governor sending to an emperor, he talked about deaconesses. I think it was like one of the first examples of Christians actually in the Roman Empire. It was from this letter. He talked about deaconesses and then slaves. And, so I was like wondering, like, was it how big of a role? Obviously, from that letter, it seemed like deaconesses in the early church had a very big role. If he's writing about to the emperor, like, hey, these women, because I think that's where it came from, possibly deaconesses, because it was something that had to do with like the root, the Latin word for deacon, and then it was
It just means servant. So.
yeah. So it was like he was like, hey, what's going on over here? There's like this thing popping up, and then from that letter you get also like they meet on certain days and so forth.
Yeah. So I mean, we have saints that were deaconesses too. Phoebe was a deaconess. We know Saint John Chrysostom had several deaconesses that assisted in the ministry there in Constantinople. Yeah, there's no question about their existence. There is a very small debate amongst certain very vehement people about their actual role in the church. But regardless, no one argues the fact that they were very involved in the ministries of the church. Like I said, the going out, the feeding, the interacting with sick, with the dying, that kind of thing. Like I said, entering into the women's only corps, stuff like that. So very involved and teaching and that kind of thing as well. There was a discussion in Romania in the 80s or 90s, now I can't remember exactly, about opening a school for deaconesses to give them liturgical or theological training so that they are prepared to be doing the education that they're expected to be doing as deaconesses. Similarly, again, to what a deacon would do, right? If we had a deacon here, he would probably take one of the classes that I teach, maybe just get up in a little bit. He would help with a lot of our other ministries in this parish. I'm sure I would have him take over some other things that I'm managing now. So he'd be, very active in the life of the parish. But, yeah. Anything else? It's a serious debate online, but in person it really isn't much. All right, wonderful. Okay. The last two bullet points, how are we doing for time? Okay, that's not bad. Laymen and women, this is just anyone who's not ordained. Like I said, in modern times, there's a wide variety of things one can do as a lay person: ringing bells, greeting, singing in the choir, baking bread, assisting with the lighting of lamps or blowing them out at the end, changing the colors in the service, all sorts of stuff. Painting icons, making vestments, and other liturgical clothing and stuff like that. There's all sorts of things that lay people do. It's, as I put here, there's still a lot of important work to be done even though you're not ordained anything specific. I think sometimes there's a feeling for people that in the Orthodox Church, unless you are ordained to something, you don't have a role. That's really not true. There are so many things that I can't manage by myself, even if I really wanted to. I just can't do everything. So, and this isn't even that huge of a parish. I mean, it's not uncommon to have Orthodox churches that are 200, 300 people. You really can't do everything then. So there's a lot of work to be done by that people. All right, and then monastics. So the reason these are here and not anywhere else on the list is because monastics are lay people. They are lay people that live in monasteries and pray for the world. They can be ordained just like lay people, and there's really no distinction in terms of the requirements for a monastic to be ordained. We give them slightly different titles. Instead of calling them priest, they're usually called hieromonk. It just means hiero is the prefix that we use, like hierarchon or any form of hierarchy, right? So indicating that they're above something, and a monk is just something hierarchy. Which technically I think also referred, well, you'll say hierarchy sometimes as well for deacons, which is a little silly, but that's what you'll see. And then bishops are always nothing special. Unlike We don't have different forms of monasticism. There is no concept of a Jesuit or I can't think of a single other one right now. I know there are. Benedictine, sure.
I don't even know what that means.
There are different, well, you'll hear these words sometimes. There's just different types of monasticism. They have different, again, now I'm speaking about a thing that I'm not, so take it with a grain of salt, but my understanding is that all of these different forms of monasticism have slightly different ways of living the life, the monastic life. In the Orthodox world, we don't have that. A monk is a monk. They live basically the same monastic life wherever they are, with obviously some local variation depending on the particular monastery. Some monasteries are very big on iconography, some are very big on candle making, some are very big on making wine for our services. They often have a specialty like that. There was a monastery attached to a seminary that I went to. It's not uncommon either, and so their specialty would be the liturgics of the church and helping train the next generation of clergy. So they often have something, a thing like that, that is their specialty, what they spend most of their time doing. So obviously it's going to be a little different if you're in a monastery that's making candles all day long, or in a monastery doing a lot of iconography or that kind of thing. There's a little mix and match, but anyway, not to get too complicated here. Generally speaking, our monastics live the same. So you will hear me talk, and as I think I've already done, but I will continue to talk about in the full monastic rite of our services, this is how we do things. We don't have any variation. That is the full rite used at any monastery. They may make changes just like we do here, but you won't find some Orthodox monastery that just has a wildly different cycle of services or something like that. And monks and nuns are always called father or mother, regardless of ordination. So it's always appropriate if you see a monk to call father or mother. I want to highlight that the bishop, it's kind of hard to see, Archbishop Edmund's picture here, the top is on the back. He's wearing black with a brown background. But if you can look, he's wearing a hat that has a cloth that hangs down from the back and goes behind his shoulders. That is not because he's a bishop, that's because he's a monk. If you see monks out and about, that they will all be wearing that. Some, there are people, so like Father Stephen, the abbot of the monastery north of here, he almost exclusively wears it when he's serving, and the rest of the time he doesn't. Some monks wear them pretty much all the time. It's just more of a personal.
Aren't there different levels to it? Seeing there's like three for the monastic world, right? Like the one, like the most rare one's like the Great Schema.
Yeah. So the simplest way to describe it is it's just an award. That's not the most accurate way to describe it, but we don't really have a novitiate. You are either a monk or you're not a monk. In the Slavic world, we have what's called a worhsip monk, meaning you're given the outer thing, and you are expected to. It's basically the equivalent of a novice, except a little more is expected of you. And then there's schema monk, and then there's great schema. Or sometimes, I think schema is also called stavafor, cross bearer, is what that translates to literally. Because the next step you're given an iron cross that you wear draped over your shoulders, underneath everything else, you don't see it. So yes, we have ranks of monks a little bit. You will probably not know that when you're interacting with them. It's not uncommon for abbots to be great schema monks, but you wouldn't know that by looking at them. From the outside, they just wear the same things most people wear for the most part. If you've seen pictures of a great schema with the hood and whatever else, that's like a when you're getting buried in death kind of thing. Most, if basically none, of the monks that I have ever seen, I've never seen a great schema monk wearing the great schema.
What, you met one before? Or at least seen them when you went to Valhalla?
I've met a few that I have been told by others in the monastery that they are great schemas, but you would have no idea looking at them. They don't dress any differently from anyone else.
Sister Daria, is it Darcy or Daria? The one, is there a reason why she doesn't wear a cross, but
She's not an abbess. Women monastics and male monastics don't wear a cross unless they are an abbot or are ordained. So a priest, monk would wear a cross just like this. And then they wear the fun hat like what Archbishop Benjamin has there. Yeah, abbesses wear pictorial crosses, but nuns don't. Yes.
Do you have to start from the bottom in order to make
Yes.
it to like any of the other ranks?
Yes. You don't have to be there for very long necessarily. It's the unfortunate reality of needing a lot of priests right now that it's not unheard of for people to be ordained a priest one day. Sorry, ordained a deacon one day and the other things before in the previous days or weeks or whatever. And then a priest the next day. So the services don't allow you to jump all the way up in one go. You can go reader, subdeacon, deacon in one service, but then you would have to wait until the next day to be priest and the next day to be bishop. Has to be at least 3 days. Sorry, there are stories, there's at least one saint that I can remember off the top of my head who was elected to be bishop despite not being Orthodox, and accepted that, and had to be baptized and chrismated, and then moved through all of the ranks in the matter of a few weeks, I think. So we remember him as a saint, so it clearly worked out for him, but it's a little difficult to imagine what that would have been like.
Yeah, all I was gonna say was something similar to that. I forgot which saint it was, but it was, I think, Saint Gregory's dad. So, because it was, when I was looking up some of the saints after we talked, it was his mom, and then she converted the husband who was a pagan, but exactly like you said, it seemed like he just went straight to bishop,
Yeah.
like almost immediately. So I was like, but then seeing this, I was like, wait, how did that happen, especially
So
back then?
he would have been everything beforehand, it just would have happened very quickly.
They just kind of left that part out.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolute requirement, so, I mean, when you say that they're made a bishop, the implication is that everything else was done in at least a few days before.
Is there like a different website to look up for the saints? Because like the one for the OCA was kind of like pretty condensed on like the lives of that saint though.
I mean, yeah, the Antiochian website also has a big list of a bunch of saints in their lives.
Oh, I meant like the actual like description itself. It was pretty like maybe like not even like
It
a couple days.
depends. It really depends on the saint. Some of them, the only thing we know is that they were born in this year and died in this year. Sometimes we have much fuller descriptions of their life. Sometimes we have a few key things we know about them. So it really depends on the saint. Yeah. Especially, so if you're just looking through the daily cycle of services, or the daily cycle of saints every day, I mean, there's saints every day. So there's a lot of them. And especially for the martyrs, sometimes all we know is the year they were martyred in.
Yeah, I think last week's there was one. It was 3 brothers or like emissaries from Persia, and like all it really just said was like they were just martyred because they were from Persia, and that was basically it. The only reason was that.
Yeah. So I mean, you can always look at some at other lists and see if they have a little more, but generally speaking, like I said, it just really depends on the saint how much you know about them. The Antiochians have a good catalog you can look at. You can go look at the Prologue of Ohrid, which is it's not as complete a list of saints as some, but what it does have is pretty good. Synaxarion is another thing we can go look at. It often describes a good amount of the saints' lives if we know much, and about feasts when those things come up. So, but yeah.
Do we ever refer to the figures in the Old Testament as ever saints, like Moses? Like his actual title now in the church would be like Saint Moses, and
So
not Saint Moses, not because that was obviously different. Like the actual old.
Oh yes, Saint Moses, the Ethiopian. Or the
Yeah, like so that would be a different, like the actual Moses and stuff. So like, are they actually considered saints too?
Yes. So I guess we haven't talked about this yet. Does anyone know what saint means?
Isn't it just like had to do like the
Yeah, but what does the word mean, Alfredo? It just means holy. So when you look at, yeah, I don't know that we have a lot of saints or icons that are in Greek. Maybe some of them over here. You'll see it either written out or abbreviated something, agios, which just means holy, agios, or whatever. In Slavonic, siati, and then the name, again, just means holy. So English is kind of the odd language out here in that we have the word for holy and then we have another word that we use to describe saints. And so that makes it a little confusing because it makes it sound like it's some special thing, and then you are rightly confused about that because it feels like a special designation. But the reality is we're just saying they're holy. So yes, absolutely, the Old Testament figures are, not all of the Old Testament people that are called out. Some of them do some pretty bad stuff and are pretty
Yeah.
clearly condemned
Yeah,
for
well,
it.
yeah, I was thinking like people like David and Moses.
Yes, yeah. And you will see icons sometimes that say saint for them. Sometimes they'll get other, we'll call them prophet or a prophet of icons.
Because I forgot which one, it might have been John or one of the other Gospels that does refer for like, I think they said like the first time, this is like they were going to saints in Corinth or whatever, and like at the bottom, I think it was like, it just, back then it just meant like these were just very holy Christians,
Yeah.
like devout ones.
Yep.
And then it said later the church canonized like, more calling out like this was, out of all of those ones, this was like a particular exemplary example of somebody.
Yeah, so our process of canonization is just a recognition that this was a very holy person. Which is why it is absolutely acceptable to pray to pretty much anyone on your own. We only do the services with like hymns and everything written for the saints that we do because the church has said all evidence points to these people being very holy people. But yeah, I mean it's very much normal to pray to close family members or anyone that was a big deal. There's a bishop from the Diocese of the South, Archbishop Dimitri, who a lot of people, even though he hasn't been officially canonized, a lot of people treat him like a saint. So I hear people praying to him, even making iconographic type images of him, even though, again, he hasn't been formally canonized. So, yeah. Just a recognition by the church that they were definitely a holy person.
And how about Old Testament questions? For the one that Ben was telling me about the Lives of the Saints one, I was listening to the one about the Nephilim and all those.
Okay.
So from that one, I'm not still quite sure, but like, so what's like the actual church interpretation on Nephilim? Because it's pretty vague, as they were trying to point out, of angels, fallen angels coming down. So like, what does it actually mean? Like, at least from the church's official stance on Nephilim and Rephaim and because I know, because even last week, Derek Mattins, when I was paying really close, I think you even said like you were even talking about like the defeat of the Anakim, and one of them I think so, like it was,
I don't remember off the top of my head.
yeah, so
Last week we didn't do that.
whichever the one I think was on Thursday, that I
Oh,
went to.
right, yes, okay.
Yeah, there was a small part in there right before talking about Holy Hierarch St. John, and there was one talking about the defeat of the Anakim.
I don't remember that specifically, but the general approach to a lot of these things is, which probably isn't the answer you want, but does it matter?
Boy.
I know this is kind of a hard thing to hear, but not to say that it isn't something that you can't find writings from various saints on, that there isn't maybe an official teaching, but the reality is for a lot of these things, the understanding of the way the world works is not a requirement for our salvation. So don't let that be something that matters.
Yeah, I wasn't like trying to do a deep dive. I was just like thought it was interesting because what I got out from too, and when I went back and was started reading those books again, was really just it was just highlighting the not so much that hey this happened. It was more just that this is why Israel, or the tribes of Israel were so important because there was all this pagan demonic stuff that was really going on over here, and this is why the set people that he chose was to start clearing the path, and all this was for the path to Christ to eventually
All of that is absolutely the teaching of the church.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just thought it was like interesting
Yeah.
because like, because obviously everybody likes to know about angels and all these other things that like
So
divine things.
Dionysius, Saint Dionysius has a writing, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but if you look up Saint Dionysius on Rings of Angels or something like that, you'll find he has a whole thing where he talks about angels and how they interact with each other and us and God. So I recommend looking at that if that's of interest. Saint Dionysius is a little dense.
Dionysius.
Dionysius, yeah. So it might require reading once or twice. It's not super long, but it is a little dense. So that would be something to learn more about angels. But yeah, in general, whether it's that or we haven't had anyone ask here, but it's not a common question. Something about the toll houses. The answer is it just doesn't matter, right? Whether these things exist or not. Again, the church may have teachings on them, but ultimately speaking, it's our belief in Christ that matters way more than anything else. It's our ability to follow him, follow his example, and do what we need to do. And a lot of the rest of these questions kind of fade away in the pursuit of Christ.
Yeah.
And again, not to say that it's like off limits and that you shouldn't look into it, but for the purposes of this course.
Yeah, it was a random one because I was been going on listening to those ones too when I'm like at work or whatever because I can't just listen to only the Gospels. I want to actually read it and decipher it more. So I like to hear like those and stuff.
Any or yeah, there's a very big debate recently online about giants.
Yeah, because they were talking about like there's two camps like this, like they're descendants of Seth, and then like the ones like are they literally angels and so
Yeah.
forth. And then like depending on which
God
church
knows.
father,
Yeah, I'm sure there are different saints that have different opinions. Follow Christ.
Yeah.
The rest is something else.
Yeah, I mean, because I got a lot more out of it. I kind of like just looking at it too, because
It's interesting.
yeah, it's interesting, but like I looked at it more, it kind of like more strengthened like Christ even more, because it's like this. It's not just hey like this one thing happened, but it's like it just shows like so much of the providence that's been going on for
The other
such a long
thing,
time.
the other reason that I'm deflecting a little bit is because, ultimately speaking, we don't have firm teachings on everything. There are a wide variety of acceptable opinions to have in church, and that's okay. We don't try to have exactly one thing that we figured out because we're talking about God and His creation. So He can do stuff that we don't understand, and that's okay. So it's pretty normal to have a difference of opinions about things. Obviously, the core, who Christ is, his interaction and relationship to us, we're not going to see debate on, except in the form of heretics. But basically, everything that's not that, all these more ancillary things, you'll find a variety of opinions depending on who's writing and when they're writing and who they're talking to and what about. That's okay. A lot of the saints talked about a literal dome of the heavens and then the flat earth in between and the dome of the hell below.
Whatever we could show.
Yeah, and like modern science is pretty convinced of the fact that we live on a round orb that circulates around the sun. But the reality is, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, whether it's flat or circular, spherical, doesn't change what we do here, right? That's not a religious question. God is God, and we follow Him, we follow Christ, and fail a lot of the time, and try to do better. And these other things, yeah, we can theologize about them if we want, but kind of secondary. So, I don't mean to,
Yeah, no.
but I
I
hope.
thought they're actually like maybe like I think like it was like from what they were talking about, like it is pretty speculative, like you were saying, like depending on which church father, like Irenaeus says one, Chrysostom says another one.
Yep. Both of those are pretty big names.
I think maybe like the reason I was just thinking because
Yeah.
maybe there is like they said like apostolic interpretation, and then like there's one that the church is like like it's not in depth, but this is kind of like what we vaguely have.
We don't really have a lot of opportunity to sit down and just surmise things, just kind of ponder on the way things work. So individuals do that, but the church as a whole doesn't really do that. necessarily strictly speaking about Jesus or our path to salvation, then you will not find any variation amongst the saints that write about such things. Great. It's pretty easy to say then that that's a clear enough teaching of the church. But it's not defined in any council, right? It's not anything that we've ever written canons about. It's just the fairly unanimous opinion of the fathers. So
And then for the bishops, they talk about like heretics too, and like the ousting of them. How come it maybe took so long for the Arianism heresy to finally get weeded out? When, because you were saying like obviously like if one said something very heretical, aka Arianism,
yeah.
why did it take so long and even actually kind of spread amongst other bishops?
When a bishop tells a bishop or a priest that they aren't that anymore, I can just keep wearing my stuff, right? I can just go to another bishop and say, he's persecuting me. I was totally fine. Take me in, please. It's not correct. It's not the way that's supposed to work. But it happens sometimes that clergy kind of defect to somewhere else. Again, we have proper channels for leaving a bishop and being received by another. It happens sometimes if we move or something like that. But
Like the Chalcedon, the whole of that split. Because I saw like that one, like,
well, especially when it's a big
Yeah.
group like that. Like, well, this synod is saying this is all okay, and they're just going to keep doing their own thing. And if y'all don't want to follow us, then fine, you guys can go do your own thing. But we're sticking to our guns over here.
yeah, because I read that it actually was, it almost, like there was like a strong possibility that it almost took actually over the whole, like it was spread, I think they said one was like 70%, like
Yeah.
the Christian world was technically Arianism or like semi-Arian.
Yeah.
So like, because like when you talked about it, I looked it up, I was like,
After it was condemned.
yeah, and so like, so that's why I was like thinking like, oh, it's just, maybe it was like in a major part, because I think he was in Constantinople.
Sure.
And so like that's what helped it too. So I was thinking, oh, maybe it was a big one, like, but then I was like, oh, it was almost like the whole Christian world at the time almost got taken over by Arianism.
Yeah, again, it really just comes down to if I, as a prideful man, decide that I don't agree with your stripping me of my rank, I can just not follow that and go find somewhere that will let me keep doing my thing. So, is that ideal? No. But it does happen. Even in modern times, I won't name names, but there are certain individuals where every canonical bishop in North America has written a statement saying, he is not ours, we don't know who he is, he is not allowed to serve in any of our parishes.
Yeah.
And he does still sometimes.
So I avoid him every time I see him come on.
So, I mean, these things happened then, they happen now. We just don't take over the church quite the same way. But
And then like would that eventually like
pride.
for bringing in the like the Syriac and Oriental one, is that really just kind of part of it too? Because like obviously like they split
Yes.
from kind of like what you're saying, so they just kind of, because like for them they say they can trace theirs back to, I forgot which bishop of Antioch that they can trace to, but
Severus.
I forgot which one, but they said like, so, but it was like you said, they replaced it with Eastern Orthodox, well now because it's Eastern Orthodox, but with the actual canon one, and then they had their own, and then it kind of split, so eventually would it just, because and then last week you were talking about receiving certain Orthodox ones, all it has to really purely be is, okay, we just denounce these certain things or accept this definition. So for them, how would their bishops kind of get mixed into it all? Like in certain areas, how would that work then?
So a lot of the big splits happened because a territory just didn't follow. So if we look at the Malankara Orthodox or Thomas Christians in India, they just kind of got forgotten about by the rest of the Christian world. They were doing their thing down there, and they weren't aware of the fact that there were other councils that had happened after the last one they went to. And then at some point in time, they kind of became aware of the fact that there were other Christians in the world beside them, and kind of had to pick a side. And that's actually not an uncommon story. There have been a few groups like that that have kind of popped up in fairly remote places that were just kind of doing their thing, and the world had kind of forgotten about them, but there they were. So sometimes it's just literally physical separation that causes that kind of split. But a lot of the big splits we see after councils were just, again, the bishops in this area don't agree, and so they don't follow it. some of those groups persist to today, not all of them, some of them do. And when we receive them back, it really depends on the particular group, but some of them we receive only by confession. Um,
But like for them, the actual, because that one would be different with the individual, like that would be like the whole.
Oh, you're asking like if the whole group wanted to come back?
Yeah, for instance, because how would they mingle back into their bishops? Because obviously it would be a bigger thing if all of a sudden like, yeah, we got to replace them with
Yeah,
our
so-
bishops.
If the Malankara, to use my example from before, or any of these other non-Chalcedonian or whatever groups wanted to come back in wholesale, um, it would be a mass baptism or mass chrismation or mass confession. Each individual would go through the process. When we talk about the baptism of Kid Bruce, it wasn't just the land, they didn't just chuck water at people, right? They all had to get baptized, we brought in. We've seen this a few times with some of these Protestant groups in the 70s or something like that sort of tried to reconstruct Orthodoxy without realizing that Orthodoxy was around, based on what they found from old texts of the way the early church worked and stuff like that. So they sort of reconstructed the church and then, oh, wait a minute, there's still people doing this. And so then they came back wholesale. But yeah, what that looked like was the community just voted as a parish that they wanted to do this, and then they were all baptized or chrismated or whatever, depending on what they needed. Sometimes the clergy were received as clergy, not always. Just the needs.
You know, it would be a little bit different for like the Greek Catholics, because like I saw like they're very still, like they hold on a lot to the Byzantine rite, but obviously they have
Yeah,
Catholic
Greek
part.
Catholic or Byzantine Catholic or something like that. Melkite. There's a few.
Maronite ones too, right?
Yeah, I
A lot of
think so.
these ones.
These are all groups that at one point in time were Orthodox, and keep in mind this is an Orthodox person telling the story, so this is our perspective. They were Orthodox, and then Latin powers came through and took back the territory. Usually, the territories that went kind of back and forth depending on when in history we're talking. And as was often the case, the religious identity was tied into the national identity, and so it was not common to have a Latin group come in and say, you are Catholic now, or we will kill you. And so you have these groups that, to this day, you walk in, you might not have any idea that you were not in Orthodox Church until they say the Pope's name. Or if you see somewhere hanging on the wall, they might have the picture of the Pope or something like that. But
Or
otherwise, it's going to look almost identical. They may very well have some very similar styles of singing, depending on where they came from. The Ukrainian Catholic Church is not going to look much different at all from
yeah.
an Orthodox Ukrainian church.
Yeah, because it was like we were talking about like when Pope Francis died, like a lot of people were questioning who, like everybody thought like, oh, the Orthodox are showing up to the post funeral, then everybody's like Greek Catholic or Byzantine. What is that? Because they look almost exactly like
Yeah.
Orthodoxy, because they retain almost everything just except for the papal side and a little addition to Nicene Creed that started a lot of things.
Even that varies, though.
Really?
My understanding is that the current stance of the Catholic world is that it is only a requirement to add the filioque when said in Latin. So my understanding is that even there you might not notice if you're in a Byzantine Catholic of some variety church until they say, like we say Archbishop Benjamin, Metropolitan Deacon, they would then add the Pope.
And then out there, like, oh, wait, well, I'm always fucking, where's the doors at real quick?
But again, it'd be hard for us to know that it was different until that point. St. Alexis of Wilkes-Barre has a very interesting story regarding that. So if you're curious at all about
I was
relation-
reading him a little bit how he actually started, he was Greek Catholic and he came here, but then the Latin rite said like, no, you need to do it this way. And then, that's all I got so
He's a
far.
good example of
Yeah.
a life on the OCA website that will be much more full.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, if you're curious, go look up St. Alexis of Wilkes-Barre.
Because it would say I started that and then he converted the whole parish, and then from there it was like 20,000
Yeah, the numbers vary a little bit, but yeah, certainly a lot of parishes and a lot of people. Alright, I missed the hour mark for us, we're pushing, oh, it's almost 8 o'clock, so we need to head out, so we can do that, otherwise, technically, I have a few more minutes. That's everything I have for the day. Just so I've asked, are there any other questions about the thing that we're actually talking about today? Whether it be garb, whether it be
You said
style
the
of
hats are very
interaction.
cultural too, though, like, because that's, like, the hats,
Absolutely, yeah.
because when the one that was in San Francisco, some had, like, certain hats, and then, like, other ones had, like, no hat, like, obviously, you didn't wear a hat, but it was,
In our form, in the Slavic world, clergy are allowed to wear hats outside of church until they've been awarded them, and then you're allowed to wear them in church. So Father George, as you see, the vested priest here, is wearing a very bright red hat. He wore it for Pentecost, I want to say. If you were here for that service.
oh, yeah, you did.
Yeah. So that's an award. Deacons don't get one to wear liturgically unless they are monastics. Bishops have that fancy jeweled one you can see in the picture of the deacon there, called a mitre. Some priests are awarded that after like 50 or more years of.
Like the Greek one, because the Greek one had the one I had here, and then the other one that was
In the
still.
Slavic world too, you'll see
Yeah.
priests that are given that mitre. The difference between that and a bishop mitre is that there's no cross on top for a priest, which is not as obvious, but there is technically a difference between the two.
Yeah.
But the exact style of the hats can vary wildly. It was a little hard for me to find a Slavic variation of the non-liturgical forms of hats. So both the deacon and the priest one are very Greek, like iconically Greek hats there in the daily wear. Slavic ones can vary wildly. Just really depends on the culture, whether it's an award or not, whether it's a particular shape and style.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Kind of piggybacking off what you said.
Sure.
So one of the things that attracted me to Orthodoxy was kind of like the way they kind of come together for teachings. But I'm learning more and more as I listen to Father speak on the whole counsel of God. Is like sometimes an audience member will bring up a question from the Orthodox study Bible, like say, "Oh, but this says that," and he's like, "Oh, well, it's not exactly." He doesn't necessarily agree with it. So I'm coming to terms like, so there's not necessarily, like you said, the ancillary stuff. So what would it be that? Is it as long as you agree with the Nicene Creed and everything there, you know, like those are the main stuff? 'Cause
Yeah.
like, one of the Protestant things that I never agreed with, like some pastors would say, like, let the main things be the plain things, let the plain things be the main things. But the problem with that is like you get into, you know, like so many different sects and denominations.
Yeah. So any Orthodox church that you walk into, any of the canonical ones anyway, you will find the same liturgy, you will find the same statement of faith, which is the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. We don't change that, we don't modify it, we don't put asterisks in it. That is our statement of faith, that is what we believe. So, talking about angels or talking about things like exactly how old the earth is, to use another common modern day thing people like to debate. Right? That's not really an important part of the story of our salvation, of the story of God's work on this creation. So if you are of the particular opinion that the earth can't be more than like 5,000 years old, you're certainly not on the side of modern science, but it's not strictly opposed to orthodoxy. It's certainly not ever mentioned in the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, right? It's not a core part of our faith. And anyone who tries to make it so is deluding themselves. You can be orthodox and think that, you can be orthodox and not. It doesn't really change the important thing, which is who Jesus was and his relationship to us. That is, bar none, the most important thing that we cling to when we talk about being orthodox, is our understanding of who Jesus is, being God and man, perfectly both, not mixed, not us on the cross, his death and resurrection, that allows us to have a path to union with God. That will be the same at every Orthodox church you walk into, no matter where in the world you go, no matter what language they're speaking, no matter what style of vestments they wear or style of singing they use, big, small church, active, dying, doesn't matter. That will be the same. Does that answer your question?
No, that does, yeah. I'm part of there's a few people on the East Coast that just gave me a few things, because the only reason I got introduced to the Orthodoxy was my friend, he's Coptic Christian,
Mhm.
Orthodox. But this book club I'm attending online, the one of the brothers told me, he recommended this church, but he looked it up for me, and I was just like, but I was like, oh, is it okay if I become Coptic Orthodox? And he told me through videos, basically the answer was no. I just thought it was interesting, because, yeah.
So, if you put something else, Coptic, Assyrian, trying to think of something like Colorado, these are groups that all break from the ecumenical councils that we consider to be ecumenical at some point in time. Except for the Catholic Church, they all have fewer than we do. The Catholic Church has a gazillion more. They call almost every council, it seems ecumenical. But so because of that, there are things that we consider to be fairly core and important to our faith that have been left to opinion in their world because they just didn't have those councils, and so they didn't formally define that yes, it is definitively this way or not. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's any question. So technically, icons are something that we remember as being formally declared as an important part in the Seventh Ecumenical Council and the restoration of icons. But they were clearly very important prior to that, and every Orthodox church of pretty much any variety has icons. No one would debate that just because they don't have that council to say that this is, yes, in fact, a big deal, that they are, in fact, a big deal. So it's not. It is important to note that there are many shared things that aren't necessarily for them defined in the council that are for us.
Gotcha.
But something like Chalcedon, which was very big on talking about who Christ is, that was one of the ones where they were very clear, Christ being God and man, perfectly both unmingled. Whereas in the non-Chalcedonian churches, my understanding is there's some variation in the exact language they use depending on the particular group, but generally speaking, they'll say he is both perfectly God and perfectly man mingled into one nature. And from our perspective, that doesn't work, but they hold that it does. So, from our perspective, no, it would not. You are believing that Jesus is either something else that his saving works in a different way, or depending on the group, even wildly changing Christ's divine and human interaction. There are still a few, I think, like the Assyrian Church of the East, that split even before the Council of Chalcedon. So anyway, they just have a different understanding of who Jesus is and his relationship with us and his relations with him.
Okay, so that does change the nature of God in that sense, or?
Well,
Okay.
not of God per se, but of Jesus, yes.
So Jesus, okay, yeah. Because I attended one of the services and they had the same creed and everything. I'm just
Sure, yes.
Yeah, but then, like you said, I guess there's some things to the untrained eye like myself I wouldn't catch on. So
Yeah, I mean, their services follow a different rubric, so I don't know that there's anything inherently wrong with their liturgical practice, the way that they move around the church, the specific times they do petitions or things like that, right? But the fundamental understanding of who Jesus is defined in our ecumenical councils, and it's something that you will not find any variation in any of what we consider to be canonical Orthodox churches. Rokor, Antiochian, Greek, Albanian, Georgian, whatever. But again, Coptic, the Ethiopian, the Ankara, the Assyrian Church of the East, and then like Byzantine Catholic, which are often variations of those, but that have united with Rome. they all have a different understanding of who Jesus is and the interaction between the divine and the human. So, yes.
I gotta keep going.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I need to be done as well.
Thank you
More
for
work,
this.
but yeah, as always, if you've got questions, email me or message me in
Thank
some
you.
form, and otherwise, I'll see you all next week.